Oh. Today is February 24th, 1986, and in 6 weeks I will be 78 years old. I have lived a full, rich life, and now I want to tell my family all about it. To begin at the beginning, I was born in Ray, North Dakota on April 9, 1908. Parents officially named me Estella Avery. I was named for my father's mother, only she had an E at the end of her name, and I have an A on mine. I have been called Stella a lot of my life, and many times I have been called Estelle. My mother was then 19 years old, and my father was about 21. I don't remember too much about the house we lived in when I was a baby, because we moved about 3 miles west of where I was born. An interesting thing was the girl that helped take care of me became my future sister-in-law. She was then 11 years old. And I didn't have any nicknames as I was growing up. And I really can't remember any of the first chores I had to do. But the babies came along regularly, so I suppose I helped mostly in taking care of them. We lived on a farm. My dad worked very hard, and times weren't too good. He farmed with horses, as tractors were unknown in those days. My really first clear memory that I can remember is that a very dear friend of my mother died, and they took me along to the funeral, and I can remember I stood so close to the edge of the grave that a neighbor lady pulled me back. And that is the first real memory of anything happening in my life that I can remember. I can remember my first day in school very well. I was 7 years old when I started to school, and my mother said, "Keep your dinner pail under your desk." And I had a nice, shiny tin dinner pail. It had a tray in the top, and on the top was a place to put the tin cup. Well, the teacher said to keep your dinner pail in the cloakroom, and she would take it into the cloakroom, but I'd go and get it again and put it under my desk. And I don't remember what happened, if we left it there or she finally left it under my desk. And the games we used to play were Pom Pom Pull Away, London Bridges Falling Down, and what else were there? Pom Pom Pull Away was a kind of a rough game, it seemed like. Then we had swings and things in the schoolyard, and we used to play on them. And then when I was in the 3rd and 4th grade, we had a country school that was about less than a quarter of a mile from our place. And we've had school only 2 years there because most of the children wanted to go to town. We only lived 3.5 miles from town, and there were school buses running, so it wasn't too hard to get back and forth to school. But roads weren't then like they are now. I can remember in the spring when the snow was melting that then we would go to school in a wagon box pulled by horses, but the water would be so deep in the sloughs going through the low spots in the road that the water used to come up in the bottom of the wagon box. I wasn't very sick too much of the time, but I remember when I was in the 1st grade, I got chicken pox, and I had to also ride in a little cutter, they called it a cutter. It was a neighbor boy would hitch a horse to a very small sled-like thing that they had built, and I would have to ride in that for a mile or 2 miles to catch the bus, which came from the other direction. And they evidently didn't take the blankets in the house at night because I froze my feet, and I even had some frostbite on my buttocks from sitting on these frozen blankets. And then I got chicken pox on top of this frozen toe, so I was really in misery that winter. I can remember. I suppose my brothers and sisters all got the chicken pox too. I can't remember much about favorite teachers, except there was one we liked very much. She taught in this country school that was near us, and she lived about 3 miles to the west, but she boarded with us for a while in my home. And I remember she wore high lace pointed-toed shoes. And she came home one day, and she was sitting by the stove, and there was a kind of a skirt around the stove, and we put our feet up there to warm them, and she stuck her feet up too close, and the tips of her toes caught fire, or got overheated, and she burned her toes, and I can remember her screaming and howling. When my parents met, my mother was working in a hotel in St. Paul, and my dad was working in the stockyards, and he was rooming at that hotel. And I don't know if she was a chambermaid or waitress or what, but that was anyway how they met. And they were married April 7th, 1907, just a year before I was born. And then on their honeymoon, they came to North Dakota, where my dad had a homestead. And my mother had never been away from home before, and she thought the country was quite level, because it was in the spring, and there had been a lot of snow down in the coulees. And in the spring, when the snow melted, here was a great big deep coulee right below their little homestead shack. But she said when they first lived in the shack, they could look through the cracks and see the stars. So it was a typical homestead shack. One room, I think, was all it had. I never saw it because it was destroyed or moved or something before I was old enough to remember it. And she would get so homesick for Minnesota that she would look to the east, and she'd say if some of those hills were cut down, she was sure that she could see where her home was. She came from a large family. Her mother died when she was 4 years old, and then the grandmother raised the children. There were 4 children at that time, and then her father married again, and from that marriage there were 12 more children. So it was a large family, and I met very few of those folks, so I don't have much to say about them. I never met any of my dad's folks. I corresponded with one of his half-sisters. Oh yes, his only brother lived with my folks for a while, and I can remember him quite well. That was Uncle Carl Avery. But then he married, and then he moved back to Wisconsin. After that, we lost contact with him. And my dad had 2 half-sisters, and I corresponded with one of them until after I was married, and then we lost track of each other too. And my mother's folks, I didn't know too well. My grandpa and my mother's stepmother did come out for my wedding in 1927, and that was about the last time I think that I saw him. We children had to herd cows in the fall, and in the early spring before the crops are planted, and in the fall. And we usually had to miss quite a bit of school. But that's how I learned to crochet. My mother showed me the stitches, and I took my crochet hook and some thread and used to sit on the side of the hills and watch the cattle. And that was how I learned to crochet. It was pretty tight sometimes, what I was doing, but later on I learned to crochet quite well. We had a happy family life, it seemed like. We never had much money, but neither did anybody else at that time, it seemed like. And I would have liked to have gone to high school, but I quit school in the 9th grade because every wash day I had to stay out and help my mother with the washing and other work. And in the fall it was herding cows until into October, so I missed a lot of school. So I quit school then, and then I just worked out as a hired girl, usually for $1 a day. And in those days we burnt coal most of the time in the heater and in the cook stove, which was rather hot in the summer and not as comfortable as it could always have been in the winter. My mother, a lot of times at lunchtime or supper time, Mama would say, go out in the pasture and see if you can find some cow chips. So we'd go out and bring in enough to make a meal with. They were a good quick fire, and they had a kind of a sagey smell. And the fire was soon out again, so it didn't heat the house up too much. Our water, we had no electricity, no running water. Our lights were from kerosene lamps, and we had to wash those chimneys every so often because they smoked up and got black, and the wicks had to be trimmed. And I know That used to be my job for many years on Saturdays. Be sure and clean the lamp chimneys. And my one sister had to wash windows, keep the windows clean. Even if we didn't have a lot of furniture, our house was clean. In the kitchen, it was a hardwood floor, and I could see my mother down on her hands and knees scrubbing that floor. It was a large room. We had a long table in it, stove, cabinet in the corner, washstand in another corner. And one time she was varnishing the floor, and I don't know what she was thinking of, but to keep people from stepping in the varnish, she spread newspapers on the damp varnish, and of course that stuck in the varnish, and what a mess that was. Christmases were very simple in those days. We didn't have much money. I can only remember once in my childhood that we had a Christmas tree, and that happened to be because we had a Christmas program in the country school, and when the Christmas program was over, they said we could have the tree, but I can't remember what we hung on the tree. And we had a little crib set that we used to set up, and it had little red isinglass windows in the back, and we thought that was really nice. But we never made much of Christmas. I remember each Christmas Eve we'd put a plate on the table for each of us, and then the kids would go in the other room, and then my mother would put whatever little gift she had for us and some candy. But the most memorable Christmas I think I can remember, I must have been 3 or 4 years old. My dad was working in a coal mine and digging coal, I think he must have been, because he broke his leg. And I can remember so well bringing him home and bringing him in the house. No one went to hospitals in those days. And the doctor came out and set his leg, and then he had some kind of a pulley to keep it pulling so that it would stay straight. Well, anyway, Christmas came around about this time, and we had no money. So Christmas Eve came, and my other brothers and sisters, I don't know how many there were at that time, but they must have been too small to remember what Christmas was all about. Anyway, my mother put a dish on the table for me, and all that was in it was about 3 pieces of red hard candy. My Uncle Carl was staying with us at this time, and I can remember that he ate some of my candy. I didn't really forgive him for that because I needed that candy too. But that was a hard winter, I can remember. And it seemed like we had a lot of snow, and we had a big gasoline engine that we used to grind feed for the cattle and horses. And one day, my uncle couldn't get it started, so my dad was going to go out. He was able to get up on crutches. But he went out in the snow with his crutches, and he broke his leg over again. So there he was back in bed again. I also learned to play the organ. My mother had an organ. It was a larger organ, and most of them it had 7 octaves. Most organs only have 6. And she taught me the notes on the organ, and from there I learned to play the organ. And later, after I was married, we had a piano, so I learned to play that. I ended up with 5 sisters and 7 brothers, but the sisters are all living yet, but my brothers, 4 of them have died. 1 sister and 1 brother died in infancy. My brother Raymond was killed in the Second World War, and he is buried on Luzon near the Philippines. And two other brothers have died from heart attacks. One just recently in May 1985. Well, I would have liked to have had a good education, but it was impossible. I knew my folks couldn't send me on to college or anything. But like I said before, I quit school in the 9th grade and started working out as a hired girl. But I always read a lot and was interested in current events and so on. So I tried to keep my mind active and keep up on what's going on. I like to read a lot of religious and inspirational books, and I belong to different Bible studies and things like that. My dad's mother died when he was 4 years old, and then the father remarried, but before he remarried, the 2 grandmothers, Grandma Fletcher and Grandma Avery, raised my dad and his brother Carl. And Then from then on, I do not know too much of his story, except that they lived in Prairie du Sac, Wisconsin. And I have a picture of what is supposed to be their home place in Wisconsin. It's a large square brick building, and looks like it could be red brick. But I have never been back there, so I don't know anything about those folks, if there's any of them living anymore. As a hired girl, we did everything from feeding pigs and milking cows to doing the baking, taking care. Most of the time where I worked was a newborn baby, which I took care of. But I just did everything that the housewife would do until she was able to be on her feet. Usually it was a month at such a place. And it was hard work, just as hard as if I'd have been in my own home, but I wasn't doing it for myself. I was doing it for this $1 a day or $5 a week, whichever. And I did that for about 3 years or so, and then finally I got married. My dad was very against using lipstick or anything like that. And I remember I was 16 and somebody gave me a powder puff. My mother found it and she made me burn it up. And then we had a way of wearing, a lot of the girls had not really short hair, but they would have kind of bangs, and they would take 2 pieces of maybe black velvet ribbon and put it across their forehead like. And I did that one time, and when my dad saw me, he just took that right off of my head. He was afraid we were going to grow up to be vain and proud or something, I guess. But that was one of the things that I remember. I suppose I was 16 when this happened. My grandparents, my father's grandmothers, used to send us a lot of stuff because they realized that we were kind of poor in a large family. I remember one dress they had made and sent, and it was a blue dress, a gray dress, trimmed with red. And I thought that was a pretty good dress, but it was made out of wool, and it was very warm. Another interesting thing, when I was growing up, we had a sheep at home, one sheep. It strayed to our place, and it just stayed with us all the time. We never could find the owner. So my mother would shear that sheep, take care of the wool, wash it, spin it. She had a spinning wheel, and she would knit our mittens and stockings. And I think I was in the 8th grade, and I was still wearing home knit stockings. Most of them were dyed black. Long stockings, right? Yeah. They kept us warm. Then we always had to wear a warm petticoat underneath, and most of the time long underwear. And the legs would come down around our ankles, and then we'd fold them over to make them tight. And then there would always be a bulge under our stockings. But this was most noticeable after we got to wearing lighter weight stockings when Mama quit knitting them. But I remember when we were going to go to a dance, when we kids were in our dancing years, then my dad would look at our legs when we came down the stairs, and if he didn't see that bulge, he knew we'd rolled our pant legs up, and we had to go and put them back down again. The dresses were quite long in length until the styles began to get shorter, but we dressed with what we had, really, to be truthful, we dressed with what we had. I know there was a girl in my class in school, her father I think he worked in the bank, and he'd gone to Minneapolis, and when he came home, he brought several nice dresses for his daughter, who was in my class in school, and I envied her, so I realize now that it wasn't right to envy people, but at that time, I just couldn't help it. When I was at least up to 8 or 10 years, my hair was just pulled back and braided on the side, and then a longer braid in the back. This side braid went into the back braid, and then hung down, and that's the way it was. I was raised a Catholic, and I can remember my first communion dress was a white material. They used to call it rice cloth because it had kind of little dots in there, sort of looked like rice, and I can remember that very well. Well, on an average day as a child, there was always jobs to do. My mother used to put in a large garden, and all of us children would go out and work in the garden. I remember one time, I never slept too late, but I remember this one particular morning I slept quite late. When I got up, everybody was out in the garden working, and the house was empty. And I can remember so well, I woke up and got up, and everybody was was gone out of the house, and I got so scared because I just had a feeling that everyone had left me. We had to milk cows and feed chickens. My mother raised quite a few chickens, and she would have them dressed and then take them to town and sell them. The same way with her cream and butter, cottage cheese, buttermilk. She sold all those things to buy groceries. My dad used to smoke, and she'd always try to have 15 cents left over to buy him a can of Prince Albert tobacco. And when he left his cigarette stubs lay around, she'd pick them up and empty the tobacco into another can. So when he ran out of tobacco, then she would bring out this can of already used tobacco, and he would smoke that. This money that I earned doing housework, a great deal of it I gave back to my folks because they needed it so bad. And $5 went a much longer ways those days than it did now. And we did all our own baking. I don't remember when I tasted my first boughten bread because we always baked it. And my mother had a big wash boiler down in the basement in the cellar that she used to put the bread in. And it always smelled so good to go down and lift that cover up and smell that fresh, pretty baked bread. And we had dug potatoes. We put them in the cellar in the winter. Carrots, beets, parsnips, and so on were buried in sand. So we had fresh vegetables all winter. And nothing like that was ever bought. I know I was quite old before I remember eating store-bought lettuce. They had lettuce because we always had a lot of it in our gardens. I can't say I was very popular just growing up. I never was a good dancer. And I had some real good girlfriends, but never, really the only man I ever had a date with was the man I married. He was 31 when we got married, and I was 19. And he lived, well, it was his sister who took care of me when I was the newborn baby that I mentioned earlier. Or we'd go to the show once in a while. We used to have what we called but most of the time it was just visiting or riding around. And they would cut ice and put it in this ice house and cover it with the sawdust. So in the summer we'd go and get this ice and have homemade ice cream, and that was always a big thing. And we had firecrackers on the 4th of July. And sometimes we even had community Easter dinners. It was about the only entertainment that people had in those days was to be together on a holiday. Everybody brought food, and there was always enough to eat. And I remember one time we went to, this was my husband's folks, but at that time I had no idea I'd ever be in that family. And it was the 4th of July, and it rained, and it rained, and it rained. And it seemed like every 4th of July it rained, and for years after I used to think that was why we had the 4th of July, so it would rain. But this particular 4th, I remember we were over to my husband's folks, and I don't know, I wasn't very old. And I don't know what was the matter with me, but I cried and I cried. I remember they had a pile of blankets in the corner, because if they'd have left them outside, they'd have got all wet. And by the way, we traveled just with horses in those days. And I laid on that pile of blankets, and people would say, "What was she crying for?" I don't know yet why I cried, but I can remember the first car my dad bought. It must have been about 1923 or 24. He received an inheritance from some relatives in Wisconsin, and he bought this Model T. Was that the oldest car, Model T? And he only paid, I think, $350 for it. It had side curtains that you snapped on. And I don't know how long we drove that, but that was our first car. We used to go to town with horses in the wagon, And we had a buggy that would, you hitch one horse up and go to town with the buggy. And in the school bus, we had horses on the school bus. In the wintertime, we had what was called a school hack, they called it. And it was a kind of a little cab built over a sled runners, and it was pulled by two horses. And there would be a stove in the middle of the bus. And the ones that sat near the stove were too warm, and those that sat near the door about froze their feet. I can remember being so cold sometimes that when I got out of the bus, I had no feeling in my feet, and one would almost stumble and fall. And the schoolhouses were quite warm. They had great big furnaces in the basement, and they were fired with coal. And the first few years I went to school, we did not have indoor toilets, but they were out behind the school. We had to go outside. There was no running water in them. We had to go outside to those toilets when we needed to go out. I was about in the 8th grade when we came down with the scarlet fever. We were quarantined for, I think it was 7 weeks. My brothers and sisters, my mother and I, we were all so sick. My dad was the only one that was able to take care of us besides doing the chores. It's funny, he didn't get sick too. And I can remember the throat I had was so sore, and people brought food out from town. There was one lady that stayed with us, and I had such a pain in my neck, and she would sit and rub my neck and talk and talk and talk, and oh, how I wish she would keep still because I was in such misery. Then later on, I got the measles, and I was so very, very sick with those. In fact, I kept having nosebleed all the time. They finally had to call the doctor out to tend to me. But I can't remember if the rest of the family got the measles, but I sure was sick. I can remember when we used to come home from school, my mother would have a kettle of beef, usually soup bones, on the stove cooking. And then she'd have some fresh homemade bread. And of course we were always cold when we'd come home from school. And we'd put that bread in the plate and put some of that hot broth over it. And that was so good. And she used to make a lot of good muffins. And cooking was slow in those days because you had to mix everything up from scratch. You had to build up your fire and get the oven hot enough so that it would bake. But there was always a coffee pot on the stove, and the tea kettle was simmering away if there was fire in the stove. And then there was a reservoir on the back of the stove that we kept filled with water, and then we had warm water then most of the time. We remembered to fill it always. Churning was done by putting the cream in a large kind of a barrel-like thing and turning the handle until you could tell when the cream was done. The same way with the washing machine. That had a handle on that had to be worked so that the clothes would circulate in the soapy water and get clean. Then they had to be rinsed and then hung out on the line to dry. In the winter we hung them out till they froze, and then we'd bring them in and hang them in the house to finish drying. It made the house smell so fresh with those frozen clothes, but it also was very damp in the house, and sometimes it would take all week to get an entire washing from a large family dried. And the irons that we used to iron the clothes were called fat irons, and they were heated on the stove and then carried, and there was a handle that snapped on the top, and then you carried them over to the ironing board and you ironed until that iron got cold, and then you took that back to the stove and replaced it with another one. It usually was 3 irons that made up a set, so you always had one that was hot and one that was cold. On real cold nights, when our house would be cold, the irons, or the flat irons, would be wrapped in a towel or a blanket or something and placed at the bottom of our feet. And a lot of times when I was growing up, my dad would hitch horses to a sleigh, and we'd go and visit the neighbors, and we'd bundle up in blankets, and sometimes we even had hot rocks in the sled to keep our feet warm as we were going to the neighbors. Even 3 or 4 miles took a couple of hours to get back and forth. And then when we'd come home, then Mama would sometimes take the lids from the stove and wrap them in towels and put them at the bottom of our feet so that we were cozy. Our parents had to work very hard to keep us comfortable, clothes and fed, and everything had to be done by hand. It wasn't like now you could go to the store and get whatever you wanted. I used to ride horseback quite a bit too when I was a girl. We had a slough that went through our pasture, and when we had this country school, then some of the children came from the south side of this slough, and I remember a couple of evenings after school in the early spring when they had started to thaw, and these sloughs got got quite wide, and we had an old gray horse. Her name was Topsy, and we used to take her and ride across this slough with the children that lived on the south side so they could get home at night. And by morning the slough had kind of gone down again, so they were able to walk across. And then when the sloughs were filled with water, there was a slough. There was a slough by our house, and in the spring after the snow had melted and filled this slough full of nice, fresh snow water, before we'd go to school, we had to carry some of this water into the house so my mother could do the washing. There was a lady that used to come over and stay at our place. She was very badly mistreated by her husband. He was a very, very cruel man. And she'd walk over to our place. It must have been about 5-6 miles. And she'd stay with us a few days, and I can remember how she would clean chickens. She would scrub them until the skin was just white. She'd use soap and water, and oh, how she scrubbed those chickens. Well, one time I was supposed to take her home, and I had 2 horses. I think their names was Beauty and Dewey, 2 brown horses. I had them on a buggy, and they ran away, but I managed to get them quieted down again. My dad was making hay a few miles from home, and we had to go and take him lunch. And one time I had a horse on the buggy, and I had the lunch in the buggy, and I wasn't familiar with that area that he was making hay, and it was supposed to be a slough somewhere. And I drove, and I drove, and I drove, and I could not find him. So finally I just went on home, and poor Dad didn't get any lunch that day. And I don't remember if he was too upset with me or not when he came home that night. Another time I was playing with an alarm clock. This was on a Sunday afternoon, and I wound it too tight, and it broke, so the alarm wouldn't work anymore. And my dad was visiting a neighbor, and my mother said, "Just wait till Dad gets home. You'll sure get it." But when he came home and I told him, he didn't even, I can't remember that he even said anything. Kids have to shock grain in the fall, too. That's where you take the grain is cut with a binder, and then a twine automatically ties the grain into bundles, and then we would have to stack or shock them. And one fall we kids did that. I think it was myself and maybe my 2 older brothers, and we then when we got through, then that fall my dad bought us a camera. I think he paid about $3.75 for it. It was a very good Eastman Kodak, and I think he sent to Sears for it, and we used that for many years. When my folks died, I believe that was the camera when my one brother got that. I have to make a correction here. In one place I said that 3 of my brothers had died. It's 4 of my brothers that have died. 3 of them died from heart attacks. And in another place I mentioned Catholic when I meant Lutheran, so I hope you'll correct or think of those when you play that. My mother used to sell chickens that weighed from 2.5 to 3 pounds for 35 cents a piece. One old storekeeper in Ray called her in one day, and he says, "Mrs. Avery, that one chicken didn't weigh quite 3 pounds or 2.5 pounds. Just think what today you couldn't buy anything for 35 cents. But that's the way it was in those days. Now I am going to be a little more specific about what kind of a man your grandfather was. He was not very tall, about 5'9", I think. He had a stocky build, and at one time was much overweight. His voice was soft. In fact, in his whole family, their voices were very soft and rather a slow drawl. But he had a loud, roaring laugh. He always wore big overalls. The sides were hardly ever buttoned. He had been practically bald since he was 21. He had beautiful teeth. When he was in the service, a dentist told him he had never seen such a perfect set of teeth. And he had very few extractions or very little dental work done. I think the family seemed to have gotten their good teeth from him. He was a very religious man. I very seldom heard him swear. We went to church every Sunday when there was church, no matter what the weather. It was usually 2:30 or 7 o'clock in the evening. Nothing was more important than church, and the kids didn't always agree with this, but they went anyway. He was loving and compassionate. I don't think him and I ever had a serious argument. I can't remember anyway. He only went as far as the 5th grade in school, but he was an educated man. He kept up with politics, and he did read quite a bit, and he could read quite well. He used to read to the older children. He was so proud when Lorna and Helen were teaching. Helen taught 2 years in a country school, and Lorna 1 year. And he never smoked, but he knew that some of the kids did. He was very concerned when some of the children weren't feeling well, and he loved to take a load of kids to basketball games or school picnics or whatever. And I don't know of any neighbor or person that ever knew him that didn't like him. He very seldom said anything against his neighbors. Once our bull got out and gored one of our neighbor's horses. They had an argument. He really was upset about it, and the next day he went over and patched things up between them. And he instilled in the children not to make fun of anyone because they were poorly dressed or handicapped. And we had a girl in town who was quite retarded, and some of the children really made fun of her, but as far as I know, none of you kids did, because that was against what you had been taught. And I don't think he ever spanked very much, but when he did, you knew you had it coming. When he said no, that was no. I remember when Helen was about in the 9th grade, she wanted to go to a city dance, but he said she was too young, and he said no. I can remember he went to bed and went to sleep, but she sat and cried, but she did not get to go. He was a good American, a good patriot. He was in the army in World War I. When war was declared in War II, I remember he cried when it was announced that it was over. He used to worry about the boys having to go into the service. He didn't like the Red Cross. Why, I don't know. Must have been some experience that he had in the First World War. He didn't like the Farmers Union either. He said it was communistic. He belonged to the American Legion and was very proud of that. He was commander for several years. We always had a New Year's dance, and he used to sell tickets for that. And he usually sold the most tickets when these things were sponsored. When there was an American Legion parade, he was always in it. He chewed good old Copenhagen snuff. He always drove the kids to school, and ever so often he would roll the window down to spit. Some of us in the back seat, some of you in the back seat would usually end up with artificial freckles. And it was easy to tell when he had drank more than 3 beers. He was very talkative and extra jolly. He didn't drink too often, but there were times, and I'd get upset, but I never said very much. Once at a New Year's dance, he had too much, and he blamed this on the hot dogs the Legion was selling. He was a hard worker and was always willing to lend anything or to help his neighbors. He practically rebuilt the old house by himself and was very proud of it. He was a member of the school board for 12 years. They really did a lot for the kids, and once they even let the kids have a dance in the gym, which was kind of unusual. And we opened our gifts on Christmas Eve, or I should say Santa came. When we lived in the little house, he'd take us who weren't babies down to the barn and tell us the Christmas story. Then all of a sudden he'd say, "I think I heard bells. That must be Santa." Of course, we'd all agree, but we never saw his reindeer or sleigh. The kids would come to the house, and sure enough, there were the gifts on the table where everyone sat. And the person that wrote this said she was a firm believer in the 4th grade, in Santa, until she was in the 4th grade, and some loudmouth boy told me different. He played the violin and also the organ in church. When the children were quite young, he was in an orchestra. Once they went to Minot and played over the radio. We were so proud of him. He loved to dance, and I think he taught some of the children how to waltz. And like I've said before, I never danced very much. But he liked music, which is probably why the girls all took piano lessons, and the boys were encouraged to play in the band. In 1945, Delbert was burnt very bad in a gasoline accident. And it seemed like that was when his health began to fail. He worked so hard on the farm and still went to Williston a couple of times a week to see him. He was not a well person his last 2 years. We never knew how bad until after he died. He was in the Veterans Hospital in Minot his last Christmas. And your dad, Helen, your dad, Janine, is the only son-in-law he ever got to know. And your dad was coming home on leave from the Air Force, and his car was stored in St. Paul. And your mom had just gotten her diamond, and they stopped in Minot at the Veterans Hospital to see him. When he came home, he told everyone about it. So you see, it didn't take a lot to please him, but he was so happy to see Helen and her. And it was also Christmas Eve when they were there. His last year, I don't think he felt good at all. He was often quite short-tempered and not as easygoing as he had been. He was happy when Linda Beth was born because we'd had 8 boys, and now she was a little girl. So he was happy about that. And when the girls were teaching, he would always go and get them home on weekends because it seemed to make him so happy when the family was home. And he died of a heart attack on April 21st, and he was in the garage working with the boys. And he was buried on April 25th, which is also your mother's birthday for me. We put up an argument about this, but there was no other way. That was the way it had to be. He was so well honored in town and in the school that they didn't even have a school the day of his funeral, and the stores were all closed during the funeral. Leroy graduated that May, a few weeks after the funeral, so it wasn't a very happy time for him. Told us about it, he had a way of straightening it out and hearing their side of the story too. He didn't jump to conclusions right away. I'm sorry that I haven't told the children more about their dad, but some of these things are hard to talk to, and you have to go through it first to understand how it is. I've mentioned your name, Janine, quite often because you were the first one that has asked me to make a tape like this. But if you make more prints of it, everyone will understand why I did this. I am reading a lot of this from a narrative that was written several years ago. We have a book called The Pride of Williams County, or the story of Wonderful Williams is the name of it, and Williams is the county we live in. And it's 2 thick books, and our family story is also in there. And I also have written a story about the Schmidt family, and I'm going to put that on this tape too because I think you'll find it interesting. It's also a narrative about your grandpa, Bill. William Schmidt was born at Luca, North Dakota, April 12, 1896. And I was born at Ray, April 9, 1908. They were married at Wild Rose on November 2, 1927. We made our home on land rented from O.A. Nelson, and your grandpa, Bill, with his brothers Benny and Irvin, started farming this land about 1924. The first few years they farmed with horses. Irvin only farmed 1 year, then he moved to Petersburg. Benny continued to farm with Bill for 13 years, then he also moved to Petersburg. By now they were using tractors. In 1929, the Schmidt brothers, together with O.A. Nelson, bought a Nichols and Shepherd combine. This was one of the first in the vicinity. It was pulled by a tractor, and it took another man to operate the combine. One field was along Old Number 2 Highway, and many tourists stopped to take their pictures, as combines were a rare sight. In 1927, thrashing was still done with a big Rumley tractor. This could pull as many as 20 plow bottoms. It took as many as 20 bundle racks to haul grain bundles to this huge machine, and about 27 to 30 men at mealtime. In 1928, a smaller tractor was used with a lot less men. Crops were fairly good in 27, 28, and 29, but early in the 30s the great dust storms and dry years started and continued until 1940. In 1931 there was no harvest at all. Your grandpa went to the eastern part of the state where his folks lived and helped them with harvest. They didn't have the drought and dust like we did in the western part of the state. We stowed most of our cattle and the rest were trucked to his folks and wintered there. Those years in the 30s were terrible. Dust so thick it was like a black blizzard. It went through everything and even smelled dirty. Queer waves of static were generated by the dust particles, and it wasn't unusual to see sparks darting from wires. It was uncanny. During those years, most families were on relief. Our family was no exception. A small amount of money was handed out each month with which to buy groceries and clothing. WPA work was also available, in which relief money was worked off. Dams and roads were built. In Tioga, the old school gym was built with these funds and WPA labor. Some of the churches from parts of the state that didn't have the drought sent clothes to the less fortunate. Commodities were also handed out, such as apples, grapefruits, onions, and so forth. Sometimes canned vegetables and meats were also available. No one felt embarrassed to accept this help, as everyone was in the same predicament. A mattress factory was set up in Williston, and mattresses were available for the needy. Clothing was also sewed by women on WPA. Share this talents. Tioga had an excellent symphony orchestra for a while during this time. There were no electric lights then. Heating and cooking were done with coal. During the 30s, the men dug their own coal and hauled it home free. Some of us had radios, but not many had phones. So the years of the 30s and 40s passed, and with the 40s also came the rain. Also, good crops were growing again. In 1942, your grandpa, Bill, harvested a field of wheat on the O.A. Nelson farm where we still live, which averaged 50 bushels per acre. And this news was even put in the Fargo Forum because it was unusual for western North Dakota to have a crop like this after the bad years. Now farmers were able to purchase land and new machinery, and this was when we bought the J.M. McCormick farm in 1943 and moved on to it in 1944. And we also got our first electricity and phone at this time. We always had a truck or car for transportation, except sometimes in the winter we used horses and sleds. As you know, we had 12 children, 4 girls and 8 boys, and they all graduated from Tioga School. They helped a lot around the farm with gardening, field work, and so forth. Maybe it would also be interesting to listen to the Frank Avery family story. This would be my father. He was born September 8, 1887 at West Point, Wisconsin, and Elizabeth Dahman was born at Tiers, Minnesota, January 24, 1888, and they were married April 8, 1907 at Tiers, Minnesota, and then they came to Ray, where they lived on the homestead, and I think I've had put this on earlier in the tape. Entertainment was usually getting together and visiting, perhaps card parties. July 4th and Thanksgiving were usually get-togethers at someone's home for picnic dinner. One of the farmers had an ice house. The ice was cut in the winter in big blocks and packed in sawdust. Homemade ice cream was enjoyed during the summer months. There were willing hands to turn the freezer and the dasher to lick off later. Games would be played at these gatherings, also various races, sack races, egg races, and so forth. And often a ball game was played. When large barns were built later, a barn dance was a weekly event during the summer with music furnished by local talent. A telephone line was put through the neighborhood about 1912. The Averys moved to Oregon in 1941, and there was no gas or electricity available at that time. Many magazines or books. Newspapers carried continued stories, and these were saved and eagerly read, also passed around in the neighborhood. Some magazines at that time were Capper's Farmer, Successful Farming, Dakota Farmer, The Household, gentlewoman and country gentleman, we very seldom went to a movie. A big attraction was a carnival which would come to town each summer. If each child were given a quarter, it was considered sufficient. This would buy 2 rides and an ice cream cone. The rest of the time would be spent looking around and playing with the other kids. My dad had only enough machinery for 4 horses at a time, and we children helped haul rock, make hay, shock, grain, milk cows, and so forth. There were 12 living children, but some of the older ones were on their own before the younger ones were born. And I had one sister that worked for $1.25 a week during the 30s, and she did all the housework most of the time too, and the homes had no conveniences. The boys did a lot of farm work, building roads, working in potato fields, and thrashing. During the 30s, the Averys got along as well as they could for as long as they could by themselves. Then, like most of the neighbors, they had to apply for relief, as it was called. Then, my mother sold butter, fresh spring chickens, buttermilk, and cottage cheese. One summer, she set up a 1-burner gas stove on the street in Ray, and she and one of my brothers would sell fresh buttered popcorn, which was homegrown. If they made $3.50 a night, they thought they were doing well. She made nice white shirts for the boys from bleached sugar sacks. Bed sheets and pillowcases were made from bleached flour sacks. Later, flour and feed sacks were made from printed cotton. These made attractive aprons and dresses. My dad used to haul coal to pay doctor bills, as everyone in Ray burned coal. He would leave home about 1 o'clock in the morning with horses and a double box on his sled, and he would be late. It would be late the next day before he would return. Many babies were born with just a midwife in attendance. The one usually attending my mother was an old lady. We called her Aunt Laurie. My mother had 14 children, and only the youngest one was born in a hospital. She had good health, and the children were healthy. She used to also help in the hayfield and raised a big garden, canning and drying enough vegetables to last through the winter. And as I mentioned previously, a lot of them were put down in sand, and they were just like fresh all winter. October 1st, 1939, several members of the family narrowly escaped death when a fast-moving freight train hit their car when it stalled on the railroad tracks. The car was demolished, but they were not injured. In May 1937, my dad was getting a load of coal with horses when somehow he fell off the wagon seat and was caught under the wagon. He suffered a broken arm and leg and was permanently crippled, so wasn't able to do much work around the farm. Some of the boys did the farming until 1941, when the family had an auction and moved to Oregon. And then out there, my dad worked in a sawmill for a little while, and one day he got his hand caught in the saw and injured that, so he was more crippled up than ever. And he died on March 14th, 1966. My mother died on December 9th, 1965. So that is about the story of my parents. I will tell you a little about your great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents. Now is what little information I have. Grandma Martha John Schmidt, that would be my mother-in-law, was born in Saalfeld, Germany, August 24th, 1876. And her parents worked very hard for a rich landlord in Germany. Her father was a sheep herder. He took care of many hundreds of sheep. He had a very smart shepherd dog that was his watching helper. And he always took his wool and knitting along and made children's stockings for winter. There were 7 children. And Grandma Schmidt's parents came from the little village of Klein-Vorbeck, Germany in 1888. They went by horse and wagon to Berlin. Then they took the train to the big city of Stettin, and from there they came by ship across the ocean. 6 of the children were born in Germany. This is as Grandma Schmidt told it to me one time. They got to New York the 1st of July, 1888. After a big supper, they got on the train, and it was full of Indians. They had never seen Indians before, and they were scared. The Indians were dressed with feathers in their hair and big necklaces. They came close to the children, rattling their necklaces in their faces. They sat real close to each other. They were so glad when they left the train. From Chicago, they went to Iowa to their father's cousin and stayed there overnight. And then they went to Fenton, Iowa. The father had a job there and a house to live in. John Schmidt, my father-in-law, would be your great-grandfather, and they came from Germany to Wisconsin as a young man. Great-grandfather, my father-in-law, was born June 12, 1872 in Iowa. When he was a young man, he came to Enderlin, North Dakota. He married Martha Potratz, that'd be my mother-in-law, November 14, 1894, at Hillsboro. Later they moved to Luca, North Dakota, where they lived until April 1905, when they came to Ray and homesteaded in West Bank Township. In 1914 and 15, he was a butter maker at the Ray Creamery. In the fall of 25, the family, except your dad, that'd be your grandpa, that would be your Grandpa Bill, and two of his brothers, except your Grandpa Bill. He stayed at Tioga, at Ray. But the rest of them, they moved to Petersburg and farmed there until 1936. And then my father-in-law purchased a small farm near Michigan, and they lived there until he died from cancer in June 1940. He was only 68 years old. The years were hard for the John Schmidts at Ray. They had picked very rocky land, and crops were never too good. And one person tells in her story that in 26 years they had only 3 good crops. Some years they had to ship in hay and straw and have it shipped in for $27 a load. This is kind of a hit and miss story, but I hope you can follow along with it. Now I would like to read. We had a family reunion in 1970. We had said that when Linda graduated from high school we would have a reunion. So I will read this to you. This was June 15th, 16th, and 17th, 1970. For months we had been planning a reunion for the family. We'd always said that when Linda, the youngest, graduated, we would all get together during that summer. So after much writing, changing of plans and dates, it was finally suggested that we have it on a weekday. June 17th, Wednesday, was finally agreeable with everyone. The first 2 weeks of June were given over to much cleaning, baking, cooking, and planning how to take care of the 40-some who would be arriving within the next few days. In fact, I began to think I was developing an ulcer as I felt so terrible for a few days. Later I found out some of the others felt the same way, but as soon as the different ones began arriving, all our anxiety seemed to melt away, and we felt we would be able to enjoy every minute of it. And that is just what we did. On Sunday evening, about 5:45, Herb and family arrived from Everett, Washington. Linda called the boys who lived nearby, and they all came over to my house in town. Our reunion had really begun. About 9:30, Leroy and Ginger and family came from Puyallup, Washington. With so many of the boys living around Tioga and having plenty of room, it was no trouble finding sleeping rooms for everyone. Leroy stayed at Delbert's and Helen's at Raymond's, the old home place. Cheryl stayed here with us. Kenneth and Mary came to Williston on Sunday night and stayed with her folks overnight. On Sunday, Kenneth came down here, leaving Mary to spend the day with her folks. They were still living in Washington at this time. I had canned several quarts of chicken, so decided to have them all here for lunch on Monday noon, which went off very successfully. They were also here for supper. This also included Delbert's family, Richard's, Raymond's, and Harold's, plus Linda and David. The daughter-in-laws also brought food for these meals. In the PM and Eve there seemed to be so much talking and conniving going on. But I just thought the girls were making plans for our big meal together, which was to be held on Wednesday at Delbert's. The boys went up to the Legion Club for a while and seemed to all have a very good time. They seemed to have some difficulty getting home at the same time, but they finally made it. Donald and family also joined us for this Monday evening fun. Also, Paul and Vivian Leisner happened to come over for a while. On Tuesday morning, Linda, Cheryl, and Dougie went to Williston and met Diana. She came on the Empire Builder from Minneapolis. Kenneth also brought Mary, Arthur, and Nita down later in the day. By now, everyone was here except Lorna and Bob and girls. Tuesday evening, we had a picnic supper at Harold's. We planned to eat outside, but it turned cool and showery, so some ate in the garage and others in the house. Before we started to eat, the grandchildren presented me with 1 dozen yellow roses. Cheryl made the presentation. There was a card also with all their names on it. This was a very happy evening, too. This also happened to be Raymond and Lil's second wedding anniversary, so some of the quick-thinking girls made up a corsage and put 2 candles on a cupcake and presented it to them. Now Wednesday had arrived, the climax. Herb had decided he would prepare a turkey on Delbert's rotisserie. I had the turkey in the freezer for this occasion. He took care of it, and it was simply delicious. During the day, Lorna, Bob, and girls came from Laurel, Montana. Diana, Mary, and Bill disappeared for some time during the day, but I didn't think much of it. We were all to go out to Richard's for noon lunch. Linda insisted she had to go uptown and get something for Leroy. It was already getting rather late, so I told her she could wait a while. We went out and ate lunch. We came back in about 2, as I wanted to make a cherry and rhubarb dessert for supper. I came in the front room and didn't really notice anything different, except there was a card with Mother on the envelope. I noticed something in a plastic bag which looked like a pair of avocado-colored gloves, and I thought, who would give me a pair of gloves that color? Then my glance went to the chair in which this was laying. Lo and behold, the boys had gone to Stanley during the AM and bought this lovely reclining chair for me. Meantime, Leroy was sitting out in the car, waiting to see what my reaction would be. Then he came in. Here I was, tears running down my face. He made me sit in the chair and took a picture of me. I was so overcome with emotion. I said I didn't think I could stand any more surprises. Later, Helen said there were more to come. It was planned to have a family picture taken at the farm between 5 and 5:30. So every one of the 12 children were there, all looking so handsome. We had a bit of humor when we discovered that the shoes Lorna intended to wear were still in their car in town, and the bright blue sandals she had on were hardly appropriate for such a picture. So she borrowed some from Will, which were too big for her, but as long as she stayed seated, they stayed on her feet. The photographer was Mr. Torlickson from Powers Lake, North Dakota. He took many pictures, as did other members of the family. We later wondered what he must have thought of us, as everyone was in such good humor, laughing and making jokes, but he seemed to take it all so good-naturedly. After the picture taken was done, I noticed that David seemed unusually quiet in comparison to the others' good humor. I asked him what was wrong. First he wasn't going to tell me. Then he said, well, I might as well tell you. I enlisted in the Navy today, as my induction papers were being mailed to me today. Naturally, this shocked all of us, but I will be forever grateful that he didn't tell me before we took the pictures, as I am sure the shock would have showed in them. After a few tears, we pulled ourselves together and decided that under the circumstances, it was the wisest thing for him to do. So for a few hours, we tried to put it to the back of our minds and concentrate on these happy hours yet to be spent together. Then we went into Delbert's to partake of the wonderful meal the daughter-in-laws were getting ready for us. The first thing that greeted my eyes was a huge display of beautiful flowers on the table. Looking at the card, I saw it was from Mary's folks and my very dear friends Willis and George Lukens. Someone explained to me that the red rose in the center represented Mother, the 12 pink carnations represented each of the 12 children, and the 21 white daisies represented each of the 21 grandchildren. How wonderful. Then glancing down, I noticed the beautiful cake with a family tree on it. Each family had a branch with names on little clips of paper which were attached to small skewers and inserted into the cake. I couldn't control my emotions at this point, and yet there was another surprise waiting for me. Helen put her arms around me and said, Mother, tomorrow you can go to the cemetery and see the flowers which we have put on Daddy's grave. How wonderful that they had included his blessed memory in these happy hours.
The cake was a gift from our old neighbors, the Fergusons. Wonderful fellowship. Linda said later, I never saw so much kissing going on before. Then we partook of a wonderful meal. The turkey was delicious, lovely pork roasts, salads of all kinds, and many other kinds of foods prepared by all of us living here. They had set up several tables in their garage. We used the yellow roses as a centerpiece. Everyone, 43 of us, sat down at one time to enjoy this meal together. Before eating, we said the same table prayer that we had used all these years. Later, the young folks went to the drive-in, and the rest of us visited until quite late. Soon it was time to go to the various homes for the night's rest. Those happy hours were drawing to a close, and those coming from a distance would soon be going their separate ways. Helen slept at Raymond's, Kenneth at Richards, Lorna's and Diana at Harold's, and Leroy's at Delbert's. As I write this, it is Sunday, June 21st, 1970. Everyone has left now, but I thank the dear Lord that we had these wonderful days together, full of harmony and love. It was with regret and a touch of sadness that we say goodbye, but we pray that they will arrive at their respective homes without mishap. I have had to make several pauses in reading this narrative as I become so overcome with emotion as I think of the happy hours we had together. Years have gone by. Many more people have been added to our family. Grandchildren, more in-laws, both son-in-laws and daughter-in-laws. But we are very happy. I think I have covered this family quite well. If you have any questions, please let me know. And in closing this narrative, I would like to add a few thoughts of myself. I am so happy and content in my little home here in town. I am happy that several of the family live nearby. I never really feel too alone. You that are farther away are thoughtful with your phone calls, letters, and prayers. Greatest joy now is seeing my dear grandchildren and great-grandchildren growing up into good men and women. My prayers for you all is that you will allow the Lord to have a big place in your homes as he always has in mine, and you will have a blessed life. So may the Lord bless and keep each one of you. Some of these things are easier to write than to say. That is why I have written them here. Now I'm going to finish this with some piano music.